We've come up with this idea called the Beer Freedom Index. And I think it's true that the more beer is on the shelf, the more variety on the shelf, the more creative disruption that's tolerated by society is a good measure for whether or not we're free, whether or not we're free enterprise. And if you got no beer on the shelf, you must be a socialist hellhole.
I think there's tremendous validity to it. So even though on the surface it looks like the craft beer industry is this extraordinarily unregulated free enterprise industry, it is not. But you see the ability to navigate your way through that and create this unbelievable range of products. And I couldn't imagine, I spent some time in Cuba, I can't imagine in Cuba or Venezuela or unfree countries where you would have the access to the ingredients, the markets, the ability to express your message in a way. And I think it's a very good lead indicator of how free a society is.
So in a sense, we have a wall of freedom right behind us.
We have a wall of freedom.
I mean, look at this. I'm a kid in a candy store.
The art on this wall reflects our 27-year history from there to here. Going back to our roots in Colorado, our metaphysical center, even though we're absolutely a Maryland company these days and have produced more beer in Maryland than anywhere outside of Maryland. Representations of art from Ralph Steadman, who we're very fortunate does original art for all of our beers, was introduced to us by Hunter S. Thompson, a lifelong friend of George Stranahan, who created the Flying Dog Brew Pub. So it's fun to talk about different aspects of Flying Dog, whether it's the art, whether it's our commitment to freedom of speech, whether it's the journey from Colorado to here. There's basically 4 components to any serious brewery these days. You have the hot side, packaging, fermentation, and the lab. So this lab has hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment. We track everything. We track every fermenter every day, including on Christmas and people's birthdays. To know the rate at which it's fermenting. This is a human process. It could be something as simple as we just miscounted the trillion yeast cells that go into a batch, so we correct it as we go. We test everything from the amount of dissolved oxygen in the bottles, alcohol content, CO2.
It started with this crazy idea that people wanted to drink something other than corporate Pilsner. Did you guys ever say to each other, this is crazy, why would anyone be interested in what we're interested in? Why did you take that risk?
We loved beer. I had my first beer at age 5. My grandparents came from Europe, from Russia and Italy, and they still thought the water was bad. So nobody drank the water, so I'd go to their house at dinner and get this little juice glass of beer. Got a little bit of wine from my Italian grandparents, but I didn't like the wine. I didn't know that I liked hops. George Stranahan had his first beer when he took some of his father's beer off the tennis court and drank it. So we loved that hoppy character of beer. And back, 30, 40, 50 years ago, beer did have some additional hop character to it. So when Jimmy Carter signed the bill in 1978 legalizing home brewing, it was an oversight in prohibition, as you probably know. It went from the low point in beer, 50 breweries in America. This was on the shelf. This was like 20 cents a can. And of course, we did have the light beer version and the cerveza version. So you saw this explosion, this creativity come into play. 1980, Sierra Nevada, one of just 8 breweries in America. A few years later, Boston Beer, 1990, Flying Dog. It was this great explosion of free enterprise and experimentation with the 3rd most widely consumed beverage in the world after water and tea. So it was just great fun. We didn't know much. We didn't really understand all the microbiology of beer at that time. Couldn't find wholesalers, so we had to sell it out of the back of our trunk of our car, going around door to door. But it was just this great experience, and we loved the beer. Absolutely loved the beer. This is fermentation. So at any given time, we have about 2.5 million bottles of beer fermenting. Our beers take between 12 and 45 days to ferment. This is where the wort turns into beer. We pitch yeast. Yeast reproduces, creates ethanol, which is alcohol, as well as carbon dioxide. And the goal here at the brewing industry is if there's an empty fermenter, we're brewing, which causes us to brew about 6 days a week, 24 hours a day.
And part of the cool marketing of Flying Dog has to do with sort of that radical disruptive relationship that your founder had with Hunter S. Thompson and his associate, Ralph Steadman.
Absolutely. So we had this notion, and even though the creativity in the beer was exploding, we were the first to actually bring original art to the beer labels. And like every other craft brewer, we believe that beer was liquid art. And we wanted original art on the label, something really edgy to capture people's imagination. It's part of our DNA. It's just part of who we are. We were very fortunate that Ralph did the first 2 labels for us. The first 2 were the Doggy Style with now our iconic bat wings and the Road Dog label. These were in 1995. We got these transparencies and just laughed. It was like kids at Christmas getting these labels. And so Ralph splashed on here. You have these friends in Colorado doing a brewery, and they're going to make good beer, no shit. Splashes this on the label. We loved it. We printed it. And a fellow brewer in Colorado filed a complaint with the Colorado Liquor Commission. So here's an example of competitors using government regulation to try to beat up on a competitor because the beer got tremendous attention and the label art and got so much great press they thought, well, we'll just file a complaint that shit is obscenity. Of course it's not, but the Colorado Liquor Commission said, well, here's the deal. You may think it's art. We have a complaint. We're saying it's obscenity. Pull those 15,000 cases or we'll revoke your license. That's $250,000 worth of beer. If we didn't have deep pockets, this would be the unseen part. You'd never see Flying Dog like you do today. We did pull the beer. We ran Good Beer, No Censorship. We worked with Mark Silverstein, the regional director of the ACLU, took it to the Colorado Supreme Court. 6 years later, the ruling, of course, was in our favor. Went back to Good Beer, No Shit, had a nice press conference at the top of the tattered cover, the First Amendment room. I don't recall who it was, but when they asked the crowd, why, Mr. Silverstein, with the ACLU, with its limited resources and with injustice in the world, perhaps people on death row incorrectly convicted, why would the ACLU use up its limited resources on something as sophomoric, as seemingly trivial as a beer label? And this is what comes down to basic rights of people. And when it comes to the loss of constitutional freedoms, they're always lost at the edge. They're chipped away at bit by bit. And his comment was, where there's smoke under the door, the fire's not far behind. This is about so much more than a beer label. Here's a quick peek. You might be interested in this. This is the one vessel that's unique to the brewing industry. So the mash is transferred into the lauter tun. It has a false bottom so that the water gets circulated through here as we're extracting the sugars. And then we add various specialty malts that impart both color and different flavors to beers. Ah, that is such a sweet smell.
And your labels, again and again, have become battlegrounds for the question of free speech. Michigan banned one of my favorite beers, Raging Bitch. and I wonder, like, you mentioned the link between basically crony capitalism. Like one of your competitors tried to screw you in Colorado.
Sure.
Is that part of what this attack on free speech is all about?
You have a couple different things going. So if you go back to, well, the 18th Amendment, the noble experiment prohibition, which was repealed by the 21st, there was some confusion. States had a very limited right to regulate the importation of alcohol. They took it to mean, though, they had this broad ability to ignore other constitutional freedoms and not just the Interstate Commerce Clause, but others. And over the years, because it's a vice and because you have a lot of people on liquor boards who, even though they have a constitutional background, didn't really understand what the freedom of expression applied to beer labels. Yeah, for decades they would look at it and pass judgment on the art, the name, the political correctness of it, and reject it. And it's a big deal to sue a state. It's expensive. It takes years, and you're suing a regulator. Yeah. So there's that worry about retribution. Yeah. We did. We just don't back off. Michigan rejected Raging Bitch. The Colorado ruling was at the state court level. We sued Michigan at the federal court level. It took 6 years, went up to the Federal Court of Appeals level, and the ruling was in our favor. It's political correctness. It's, in Michigan's case, anything with the name bitch. It was ridiculous, and including Bitches Brew by our friends at Dogfish Head.
Did they ban the album from Miles Davis, or it wasn't under their jurisdiction?
Interestingly enough, and it's not in their transcript, my question was, well, I'm just wondering, did you ban Bitches Brew? Well, we can't talk about that. But if you could, if you had the authority, would you? Yes, we would.
Wow.
They would ban Bitches Brew. Yet bastard was okay. So arrogant bastard, dirty bastard, backwoods bastard, those were fine. It's completely subjective. So you have bureaucrats, appointed bureaucrats, based on their personal opinions and whims, just pronouncing judgment on what they don't like. So there's just no end to that. When it came to Raging Bitch, what's odd is I could write a book named Raging Bitch or do a movie or a piece of art, but a beer suddenly falls under this jurisdiction where it can be banned. If Michigan were my only state, it could have put us out of business like in Colorado. Instead, you fight it for 6 years. But it set a definitive ruling that freedom of expression applies to beer labels. So after decades of states really just bullying brewers, this ruling set an important precedent.
What I love about the end of that story is you took the money from the settlement and created a First Amendment foundation.
We did. So first and foremost, this wasn't about the publicity. We didn't want just one big splash in the news. We wanted to continue this extremely important conversation about a value, the master value of freedom of speech. We created the First Amendment Society. The First Amendment Society is separate from Flying Dog. Aaron, the director, is working with the University of Maryland on a scholarship for investigative journalism. We find partnerships, for example, with endowing students to write articles about freedom of speech in the colleges, work with Greg Lukianoff, Can We Take a Joke, to support the launch of that movie. Because unfortunately, it seems to me that American history and civics have just been erased from the curriculum in schools these days. And people don't appreciate what freedom of speech means. It comes down to, yelling fire in a crowded theater or something like that, and don't realize that it truly is the last defense against tyranny. And if you're defending it at that point, it's too late.